The Mystery of the Far East, The Hidden History of East Asians. Hey guys, I'm Brian Osborne. I'm here with the Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, and we are so glad you're here with us today. Of course, we're the Ministry of Answers in Genesis, and we're looking at some of the research that Dr. Jeanson has done in his book called Traced. And so this really is, as Ken put it, the founder of our ministry, kind of like the new Rosetta Stone of human history. And if you go on back to the previous episode, you're seeing how really it gives us a great way to understand the world we're looking at, and how we can trace our history really back in time to a common ancestor, literally all the way back to Noah's sons and before him back to Adam. And then, of course, that magnifies the fact that we're all made in God's image, that truth we know to be true from biblical history, but also confirmed by real science. And so this series of shows we've been doing is Dr. Jeanson, really fleshing this out with different people groups around the world, showing that connection. And this show will be no different. So with all that being said, I'll turn it over to him. Dr. Jeanson, take it away.
Thank you very much, Brian. And just to review again for our real-time audience, instead of the binge watchers, I want to cover where we've come from, where we're going to go. And again, as Brian mentioned, this is part of a longer series. We're up to part 9 now, by my count of the YouTube videos, that gives you, the viewer, a preview, not a comprehensive account, but a preview of the research that's contained in this new book, Traced: Human DNA's Big Surprise. Again, it should be back in stock. We sold out of the first printing very quickly, but there's a couple more printings still coming. The ebook has been available this entire time. I think the Kindle version, it's hot linked. You can go back and forth between the color plates, which are an essential component of this book, and the text itself. We also have an audiobook. Professional reader recorded that, and it's an enhanced audiobook where you get him reading it of the text, and you can download as a PDF then the various color plates. So lots of options available to dive into this. The major tool that we're using, the thing that we're calling the new Rosetta Stone of human history, is this DNA-based generation by generation family tree for global humanity, based on the Y chromosome, the male inherited DNA. So if I have a Y chromosome sequence, if you're a male watching, you get a Y chromosome sequence. We can compare our sequences and figure out approximately how many generations ago we last shared a common ancestor. If you're a lady watching, the way to find out your family's history is have a brother get his Y chromosome tested, or your father, or some sort of male relative. And again, it's not like the ladies are the odd person out. The Y chromosome test records just one small sliver of any family's history. It's an unbroken line of male descent. So my Y chromosome doesn't tell me about my dad's mother's side, or my mother's father's side, or my mother's mother's side. And finding males at every section of that tree is important for me to figure out my own history. So males and females both have to deal with this limitation, but there's ways around it. And what's exciting to me is just how complicated, messy, fascinating, interconnected all of our family histories are. And I can say that confidently because of what's in this tree and what we've seen and observed around the globe. So this is what we're focusing on in the book and in this series. You can find more of the videos in this series that we've gone through. And again, if you want to keep up with what's going on and bookmark videos that'll still be forthcoming, you go to the Answers in Genesis YouTube page, find the playlist tab, and find this playlist then of the videos, Traced: DNA's Big Surprise. We've been focusing on these last few episodes, finishing the story of the history of peoples. This book, Traced, is first and foremost a history book that tries to answer this question that bothered me for many years. Who do we come from? And I try to answer that question and organize the book around 7 of the world's major civilizations or cultures, one basically for each section of the globe. And in trying to tell the story of one of these cultures, because everyone's interconnected, you end up telling the story of the entire planet. In the first mini section of this series, again, if you watched it in real time, you know we did about 6 videos, then we took a break, and then we resumed again. And in this resuming series, we talked about the remaining 4 cultures, civilizations. We talked about 3 originally, 4 left. Well, now we're up to 6 of 7. We covered the Middle East, South Asia. Now we're talking about East Asia. And then in the next episode, we'll talk about the history of the Pacific, and that'll have given you a broad overview of what we're covering in terms of human history and how DNA records this. Now, if you're of East Asian descent, and we're focusing on the history of East Asia today, I apologize in advance. I have to back up here and for our Western audiences, refamiliarize some of them with what region of the globe we're talking about, give them some very basic concepts of here's the peoples and the overall view of this. We'll come back to the details in a few minutes. And especially if you're of East Asian descent, I've got something in particular I want to tell you about at the end, and opportunities for you going forward to be able to figure out more of this history. Again, I want to emphasize this research is really just the beginning. It's a thick book. There's a tremendous amount of data in it, but this is just the first stages of unraveling the story of the people of our planet, the history of the people on our planet. There's so much more to be discovered, so many more fascinating questions to uncover. I'll tell you about where we're going at the end here and how you might be able to participate in helping us figure out these questions in the future. Okay, so if, again, you're like me, you took world history, and world history was primarily the history of Western civilization with perhaps just a passing glance at the East, you might be scratching your head saying, so what are we talking about, East Asia? And maybe your only thought that comes to mind when we say East Asia would be communist China. There's much more to it than that. Perhaps you think of the Great Wall of China, all that, yes, relevant to the region of the world we're talking about. If we place it on a map, when I say East Asia, the way I'm defining it now for our purposes, includes not just modern China, but also northeastern Asia, including parts of Siberia, Mongolia, down here into Southeast Asia, and the countries of Burma and Thailand and Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam and the rest, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines. You've got Japan and the Koreas. All that's included. We'll talk about this watery island region in our next episode. But East Asia has a significant amount of diversity in it. It's this whole section of the globe that I'm referring to. For many Westerners, it's unfamiliar, again, because it hasn't been taught as much in school. But also, East Asian language, culture, there's so many differences or things that are perhaps foreign to the Westerner. Chinese language is tonal. For many Westerners, it's a difficult concept or a difficult type of communication to learn. The Chinese script has this appearance. There's not the Roman letters that they use. Chinese art and sculpture and architecture, all this, and East Asian, I should say, in general, is a stark contrast to how the Western world does things. Just the fact that it's different often sets the Westerner back. This is the region we're talking about. It seems foreign. Religions are foreign. Taoism, Buddhism. Sure, atheism is growing in the United States. You have a significant amount of that in communist China. The point I'm getting at is, yes, East Asia is foreign to many peoples in the West today, but ultimately, all the peoples on this planet are connected in more ways than even I would anticipate. So get ready for some surprises. The questions we want to answer together in our short time together revolve around these two. Who were the first people here in East Asia, and what happened to them? They go together. Whoever was here first, did they survive? Were they conquered by other people? Do their descendants exist with us to this day? And this will be the full scope of what I'm asking will become clearer here as we go along. Rather than begin with DNA clues, I want to set the stage by discussing other fields of science. In a sense, what I've been trying to do in some of these other places as well, but it becomes even more relevant here. Let's begin with archaeology. Archaeologists will talk about cradles of civilization on our planet. We've referred to a number of them in this series. We talked about in the Middle East, the ancient Sumer, with South Asia, the Indus Valley civilization. Of course, over here is Egypt, the Minoans, the Olmecs in the Americas. In East Asia, then, is the Yellow River civilization. So archaeologically speaking, there are peoples in East Asia from the earliest stages. Who were they, and what happened to them? I want to now bring in another line of evidence that will expand our view and perhaps broaden our expectations, broaden mystery. I've mentioned in previous episodes how languages today can be grouped into language families. And again, for Christians and creationists, let me back up a moment and set the biblical framework for this field and why I think it's so relevant to thinking about how many different types of people were in East Asia from the outset. I would say that after the flood, Noah and his family, his wife and their sons, 8 people, Noah and his wife, his sons and their wives, 8 people in all, exited the ark, were commanded to be fruitful and multiply, spread out. Their descendants did not. So we went from 8 people to maybe 1,000, 10,000 people. They didn't spread out. They tried to build a city and a tower that reached to heaven, and God said, I'm going to force you to spread out by confusing your languages. And the heads of the families, I would say, who spread out after that event, this is the total population of the globe at that time, are the men listed in Genesis 10. So I see the men listed in Genesis 10, about 70 names in all, as the heads of these ethno-linguistic groups. Now, is there any connection between that biblical narrative and the modern discipline of linguistics? And I would say, yes, I think there is some pretty clear connections. The over 7,000 languages in our globe today can be classified into more inclusive categories known as families. And if you just take the raw value today, there's about 150 living language families. That's over twice 70. There's a huge chunk in the Americas. I think with time, the number of American language families, Native American language families, will be reduced. And some of the research I've been doing has pretty significant implications for that. So, as a first rule of thumb, language families seem to be a good guess as to who were these people spreading out. And the whole reason I'm bringing this up is these are the earliest people groups. So if you want to get a sense for who was here in East Asia at the earliest times and what happened to them, from my perspective, from a biblical perspective, language families are a tremendous place to start. And they also highlight the tremendous diversity that exists in East Asia today. So in this map, I want to draw your attention to each one individually. I want to begin with lesser candidates and go towards greater ones. You can see here, I said basically Siberia, Mongolia, China down through here. I'm calling all of this East Asia as a broad term. That's my definition for our purposes. Turkic languages in green, darker green, spill over here into northwest China. You probably are familiar with some of these. The Uyghurs, who are being persecuted in northwest China, sent to concentration camps, they speak Turkic languages. I'm not necessarily going to include them in the East Asian discussion. I already alluded to them in our discussion of the Middle East and them belonging to perhaps to a specific genetic branch that we call G. Even if we exclude them, what I want to show you is there's still a tremendous amount of linguistic diversity left. Way out here towards what's Alaska now. In this dark red, you have Chukoto-Kamchatkan language family, potential early candidate for way out here in East Asia. In yellow, you have Mongolic. Orange, you have Korean. Green, you have lighter green, you have Japanese. There is some discussion as to whether or not these should be all considered separate language families or language isolates, or if we should classify them together as part of the Altaic language family. Even if yellow, orange, and green all belong to the same grouping, and therefore the same ancestors coming from Babel, you still have a tremendous amount of diversity left in East Asia. Chinese is classified along with Burmese and other languages here in pink, the Sino-Tibetan language family. In blue, and I'll have a more zoomed in map of this in a few slides, so you can see the details. Tai-Kadai is a separate language family, including Thai, Thailand. Vietnamese belongs to the Austroasiatic language family. And then this big swath of territory, including all the way out here in the Easter Island, which we'll talk about more in the next episode, and in the west, Madagascar. All of these belong to the Austronesian language family, which is thought to have originated in Thailand. This is one of the greatest migrations of peoples in the history of our planet. Also in yellow, I have the Hmong-Mien language family. I've been in discussions with some Hmong individuals, and they've raised the question of whether or not Hmong should be classified as a separate language family. Perhaps it belongs in Sino-Tibetan. I have it as a separate family in the book, but just keep that caveat in mind. So if you count all these up, based on linguistics, you have the potential for 10 or more ancient Far Eastern peoples in that part of the world from the earliest stages. So archaeology tells us there's something there early. Linguistics says there may have been many people groups there early. I want to bring a few other lines of evidence that almost argue the opposite conclusion. And the reason I bring this up is because when we get to genetics, all of these lines of evidence play a role and form and frame the conclusions we're going towards and the mysteries yet to be solved. I think it almost goes without saying, if we think of, as another line of evidence, the physical appearances of people in East Asia, there is clearly an underlying unity. The whole concept of there being Oriental peoples, we all know what that refers to. It's a certain type of skin tone, hair color, hair type. Are there differences in East Asia? Absolutely. And of course, if you look at this diagram that I have in my book, I've very carefully selected the representatives of these people in these various countries. Yet despite the differences among Indonesians versus Siberians versus Japanese, there still is this underlying set of physical features. So on one hand, linguistically, huge diversity. In terms of physical appearances, there seems to be this underlying unity. How do you make sense of that? Genetics will play, I think, and give us an explanation momentarily. Another line of evidence that takes us in the direction of East Asian unity is the field of population history. I've graphed out here from mainstream sources the population growth for various subsections of East Asia. This line right here is for China proper. Not even the whole modern landmass of modern China, but China proper. I should say the modern Chinese country. There are subsections of modern China, Turkestan and Tibet, Inner Mongolia and Manchuria. These things right here would still be considered China, but I'm graphing them separately. Taiwan, Korea, Japan, Burma, Thailand. My point here in this graph is to show you that China proper outstrips everywhere else in East Asia in terms of population growth. So it seems, perhaps, we could speculate that whoever got to the Yellow River Valley with its fertile agriculture gave these people, perhaps the Chinese, a head start so that their population just exploded. And that elsewhere in East Asia was much slower. If you've followed this work, or if perhaps you followed some of the book, we already know that there's a connection between population growth and the branches on the family tree. Let me just say that peoples who are numerically dominant tend to have the biggest impact on the family tree. It'll become clearer here in a moment. I just wanted to show you, in terms of raw numbers, Chinese people and China proper has long dominated this region of the globe. And so if we find some underlying unity that connects us back to ancient China, perhaps we shouldn't be surprised. One last field that I want to bring up here is indigenous history. What do the peoples themselves of East Asia say? Here's where we came from. And I want to bring up a map of what was basically then China in the first millennium BC. Many of the centuries within the first or the most recent millennium BC involve a significant amount of political disruption in the land that we now call China. Now, this period of Chinese history does not, we wouldn't call what the modern Chinese landmass all of China. China then, so to speak, was just sort of this section over here, a much smaller subsection. There was a tremendous amount of fight from about the 700s, the spring and autumn period, 700s BC to about the 200s BC. The reason I'm showing you this map is some of the people groups around modern China claim descent either from one of these kingdoms in China or regions around it. The Vietnamese claim that they descend from one of these warring states. Even though they're classified as a separate language family, they say, we came from up there. The Koreans will say, we came from Manchuria, perhaps around 100, 200 BC. So even some of these peoples themselves seem to hearken their ancestry back to Chinese. So what's the explanation for what's going on here? How many people were here in the beginning? How many separate peoples? And what happened to them? These clues suggest unity and diversity, depending on which ones you look at. Now, what I want to bring into the equation is what we're calling this new Rosetta Stone of human history, this DNA-based generation by generation family tree for global humanity that's based on the male inherited DNA, the Y chromosome. And I want to begin by looking at a branch, a section of the tree known as O. Again, these letters just designate deeply branching subsections of this family tree. I'm going to zoom in here on this O and rotate it and highlight for you the various subsections of it and the dates, because these subsections have different geographic distributions and therefore potentially different historical explanations. So this is that same branch O, but instead of coloring it dark blue, I've recolored it to show you the various subsections of it. And then I'm going to put these subsections on a map. O1b is up here at the top in gold. It has an ancient separation from another subsection of O1b, O1b2. I've separated them because, again, there's some intriguing geographic data that emerges when you highlight it this way. Origin here of the two of them, separation way back here around 1000 BC. A brother group to these is O1a, highlighted here in this darker teal green. Again, around 1000 BC is when this originates. Going down the tree, I'm not going to show you the entire thing just because the date of all this is the more important part. Again, around 1000 BC is when this other group in lavender, O2, originates. Okay, so far, I've showed you O. I haven't showed you, I've told you that this is a big deal in East Asia. I haven't given you a map yet to highlight where this is. Let me do that now. I want to show you a map of where O1b2 exists today, because it's quite narrow and correlates with the Korean and Japanese languages. So O1b2, here on the map, the size of the circles represents the relative abundance. Biggest circles are in Korea and Japan, small circles over here in China. That's where the Korean and Japonic languages are spoken today, and there's a significant correlation between the two, as if perhaps these peoples came from O1b2, and the time of the origin of this branch is old enough that it becomes a plausible candidate to give rise to the Korean and Japanese peoples. I'll add some more context here in a moment. O1b2, O1b is technically this entire section, but I've separated out from O1b, this O1b2 lineage, because of this very clear geographic correlation with Korea and Japan. The rest of O1b tends to be found not so much up here in Korea and Japan, but down further south in mainland Southeast Asia and island Southeast Asia, even all the way over here to Madagascar. Now the map, zoomed in map of those language families I alluded to earlier, Hmong Mien, Tai Kadai, and Austroasiatic. Again, if we say that language families might give us a good approximation of separate groups that came from Babel, this might imply that 2 or 3, depending on how you classify the Hmong Mien languages, groups came from Babel, would have an ancient origin. And we find this lineage that's not a perfect overlap with these language families, but there's some of the biggest circles are down here in Southeast Asia. What about Madagascar? Well, one of the East Asian language families, Austronesian, Austroasiatic is here by Vietnam. Austronesian is thought to have originated here in Taiwan. And again, one of the greatest migrations in human history. These peoples migrated down here through what's now the Philippines, landed down here in Indonesia. Some ended up migrating all the way over to Madagascar. The Madagascar language, Malagasy, is the language of Madagascar, is classified as Austronesian, as is the language of Easter Island. And so the fact that we see O1b over there in Madagascar implies also some connection to the migrations of these peoples. Now, archaeologically, it appears that the migrants from Southeast Asia, Indonesia, to Madagascar happened fairly late in the AD era. And so if it happens fairly late, no surprise then that perhaps there was a whole mixture of lineages. I'll show you one more lineage that also ends up in Madagascar. My point is, it's plausible that O1b may have had something more to do with Tai Kadai, Austroasiatic, and that over time the lineage of these peoples spilled on over here, so that when the Austronesians came down, they brought that lineage as well over here to Madagascar. Again, I say that because the next grouping I want to show you, O1a, looks like the best candidate for the Austronesian peoples. The largest circle here, I think it's close to maybe 80% of the Taiwanese mountain aborigines belong to O1a. And again, O1a exists all the way down here over to Madagascar, also among the Maori of New Zealand. These are some of the places that the Austronesian languages went. O1a is not found in every place that Austronesian languages are spoken. However, it does have that connection to Madagascar, high levels in Taiwan, found in New Zealand. The last lineage that I want to show you, the map of it at least, is this O2, which again originates about 1000 BC, splits away from the others about 1000 BC. Long story short, this branch appears to be one of the strongest candidates for the early Chinese people. It's found beyond modern China. However, the largest circles today are found among the Chinese. Here, this circle is the Han Chinese of southern China. It does extend down here into Indonesia, all about here into some of the islands. But recent history has also seen ethnically Chinese people migrate and live in these places. So I'm not at all surprised then, or I should say I think we can easily explain the fact that O2 exists beyond China because of the migrations of Chinese peoples, even if it wasn't part of the political history of China. You don't see Chinese kingdoms that extend far beyond the modern Chinese landmass, but the Chinese peoples themselves have migrated beyond those borders. So I've just led you along a path of believing that perhaps O1b has something to do with an ancient Southeast Asian people group, and O1b2 with perhaps ancient Korean and Japanese peoples, O1a with Austronesians, O2 with the ancient Chinese. And despite saying all that, the most fundamental fact from this diagram that I've referred to several times is the fact that all of these lineages are connected and all around 1000 BC. And if you're a creationist, a Christian, you say, okay, where do you Babel? Probably 1000 years prior. My point is the timing of all this suggests that this comes from a single ethno-linguistic group migrating from Babel. Even though there's correlations with some of these other language families today, it does seem to imply that the origin of all these is still here. In one spot, in that people of perhaps Chinese, Sino-Tibetan descent have intermingled and migrated to all sorts of other spots on the planet. I'm still saying it's Austronesians who came down here, but I'm suggesting that some of these early Austronesians ultimately trace their origins perhaps to the same people at the Yellow River Valley. So if we take these genetic data and try to line them up with everything we've seen before, perhaps this is why there's an underlying so-called Oriental appearance among the diverse peoples of East Asia. Genetics suggests this underlying haplogroup O unity as well. This would be consistent with the Chinese peoples dominating numerically population sizes up and down East Asia. It would be consistent with the indigenous histories of these various peoples, like the Vietnamese and the Koreans, implying some sort of connection to the ancient Chinese area. Archaeology has one cradle of civilization. But what about linguistics? Why are there so many different language families in East Asia? Doesn't that imply there were multiple groups that came from Babel? What happened to them? I haven't told you the full story of haplogroup O. If you go back further on the O branch, beyond where O1b and O1a and O2 come together, O connects to haplogroup N. And just so you can see here the date, 2000s BC to 1600s BC. This still isn't immediately post-Babel for reasons I don't have time to get into, but it gets you closer. And N does not look like a Sino-Tibetan or Chinese lineage. The largest circles that we see today, the largest percentages are found primarily among Siberian or Northeast European, so like Finnish people, the Sami of Norway, Arctic peoples, these sorts of things, of Eurasia. And again, to make a long story short, I don't have time to justify this. Some of the details of haplogroup N, which again, not strongly Chinese, but there are Chinese men in there, and the connections between the Chinese men and the non-Chinese is also consistent with a non-Chinese origin. So in this particular study, there was a Northern Han individual right here who connects to Russians, to Yakut people of Siberia, way back in the 100s to 400s AD. There's another group of northern Han men who connect to other groups in East Asia in the 12s to 1400s. If you know Chinese history, the Han Dynasty falls at the hands of Central Asian invaders in the 200s AD, smack in the middle of this range right here, and is ruled by foreigners for about 300 years. The 1300s is the Yuan Dynasty, or the Mongol Dynasty in China, when Mongol invaders came in and ruled. My point is the timing of connections between indigenous Chinese, who only a few of them belong to Haplogroup N, and the rest of the men on Haplogroup N fits the timing of foreign invasions into China, as if someone from the outside brought Haplogroup N into China. So N represents a fairly good candidate for a non-Sino-Tibetan group. Perhaps there were more than one early people group in East Asia. Doesn't get you up to 10, doesn't explain the origin of the Tai Gadai or the Austroasiatics or even perhaps the Hmong. Again, the dominant lineage among Austronesians today, at least in Taiwan, would seem to be something connected to China. So what do we make of this? How do you explain it? And what I'd like to suggest is, I think there are still lineages out there that either have yet to be discovered or whose history has yet to be unraveled in detail. In our South Asia episode, I talked about Haplogroup F existing in some of the minorities of India. Haplogroup F exists in this map. Excuse me, let me back up a second. Haplogroup F exists in some of the minorities of India. I don't show it on this map because it exists at very low levels or undetectable levels nationally. If it's less than 1%, I don't show it on the map. National levels in Southeast Asia of F, and only Southeast Asia, not China. Only Southeast Asia are low. Vietnamese is 2%. I could show you a map if we had time where we drill down into some of the minority groups in Southeast Asia, and there it exists at higher levels. Because it's so rare, we don't have a lot of data on its history. It does have an extremely deep origin consistent with coming from Babel and landing in Southeast Asia. This to me is a strong candidate for being an ancient, straight from Babel origin. There still is the question of how this relates to the southern Indian, the forest peoples, when they separated, because there's F down here as well. But this is something that is, from my perspective, high priority for investigating the history better to unravel some of these early East Asian history questions. Haplogroup C, you can find high levels in Siberia, Mongolia. It does come out here into the Pacific, which is why I'm going to talk about it more in the next episode of History of the Pacific. Haplogroup D does exist at high levels in Japan or among the Ainu, Tibet, and such. I'm not going to focus on them much now because, as you'll see in the next episode, their origins come into East Asia from elsewhere, and in a manner that doesn't quite suggest a strict correlation with these language families that look like they're more indigenous to East Asian. Let me summarize, make a long story short. The Chinese people and written Chinese history dominates much of East Asia. Maybe I shouldn't say East Chinese history. We have a lot of Chinese records, and so that becomes a lot of the discussion. Even if we didn't have them, Chinese lineages dominate much of East Asia, and of course, Chinese would say we're part of the longest. They say we have the world's longest or most ancient continuous civilization. And the fact that it's been continuous and that East Asia has been protected geographically from foreign invasions, or because the Chinese themselves build walls in the north to keep the foreign invaders out, has led to a dominance of Chinese Sino-Tibetan lineages in East Asia today. And so in a sense, I'm not surprised, given everything we know about Chinese history, and again, I don't have time to derive it and justify it, and about East Asian history, I don't think it's quite surprising that Haplogroup O or something that seems fairly East or Sino-Tibetan in origin dominates East Asia, and that perhaps the Chinese would have overtaken and assimilated many of these other groups at an early stage of history. If all that's true, what I'd like to predict is that there are more lineages left to be discovered in East Asia. There's a mystery that remains, but I think some of this mystery is solvable. And I've already been in contact with some East Asians, so Hmong, Korean, Mongolian. If there are others of you watching, you come across this video, and you'd like to participate in future research, we're in the beginning stages of forming an East Asian study group to dig into these questions further, to try to combine some of the indigenous histories of these peoples, especially non-Chinese peoples, and synthesize it with more genetic investigation, perhaps with archaeology, to try to dig down and nail down exactly what happened at the earliest stages of East Asian history. Yes, the Yellow River is recognized as a cradle of civilization, but what about all these other language families? Who did they come from? Who were the earliest peoples and what happened to them? The Yellow River people seem to have grown and dominated much of East Asia. We can answer that question. But what about the rest? What happened to them? Who did they come from? A lot of those answers are left to be uncovered. And I'd love to work with you, especially if you're of East Asian descent, and in particular, if you're of a minority descent, on unraveling some of these questions. You go to that website, click on that link, you can enter your name, email address. The message goes directly to my inbox. Again, there's been, to date, about 450 people who've corresponded, a few of them of East Asian descent. And I think I've also mentioned this too. There's been a number of Native Americans who've responded. We've been forming a Native American study group. And my hope is all this continues to grow, and that for every region around the globe, the people there get excited about this and advance it forward so we can begin to solve many of these mysteries. This book, Traced, again, available in print, ebook form, audiobook form, enhanced audiobook form. You can pick up a copy. We ran out of the first printing. Second printing should already be here. Third printing may already be here as well. And we'll keep printing it as demand continues. In future episodes, once we get the 7 civilizations finished, we're going to talk about some of the science behind it, and where this book, Replacing Darwin, will play a much bigger role. Simple version of this is Replacing Darwin Made Simple. Again, if you just want to connect with me on social media, there's a number of places where you can do that. This is part of the hidden history of East Asians. We've got some answers to it already. The earliest stages I've discovered are in an increasingly intriguing era of this part of the world, the history of this part of the world. And I'm anxious to work with you watching to unravel more of this. So I'm going to stop now and turn it back over to Brian to take it away.
Well, what an exciting possibility to join in on this research. And as you listen to this, it's so awesome to see this connection of genetics and biblical history, looking at East Asians, last session, in this valley, before that, the Middle East, and kind of drawing all these connections. And really, it's amazing, as Dr. Jeanson points out, that it's the young Earth time scale, that biblical time scale. It's really the hero in connecting all these dots, and really a biblical truth that God made man and woman in His image. He put in them the genetic diversity necessary to produce the wonderful variation we see today. And so all those things are key to explain what we actually observe. And really, with this sort of research, creation scientists are leading the way and actually explaining our origin, connecting these dots. And so what a great chance to be part of this research. I know I want to jump in. My lineage may not be as exciting, but I want to throw in, I want to find out my connection. I really do. I'd love to see that. But especially in these different branches that are a bit more muddled as far as our understanding of them, getting more people in part of that, man, that'd be awesome. I know I'd like to be part of it. I hope you will be too. So please take advantage of what he suggested earlier and just join in on this ministry of really showing the world how the Bible connects to reality and that fundamental truth that our ministry is all about. That the Bible is right about history. It's right about morality. It's right about salvation found in Christ alone. It's right about everything because it's the Word of God. And really, this is really just confirming that in a very powerful way. And man, do we love it. So I hope you enjoyed this session. Again, encourage you, jump in, be a part of this. Contact Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. He would love to connect with you guys on this. And we look forward to seeing you guys next time. God bless.